Hi, this is Mrs. Chavez. We're studying Section 3 of Societies at the Crossroads, the Chinese Empire. The Chinese Empire and the Qing dynasty experienced even more difficulties than did the Ottoman and Russian empires during the 19th century. The European powers inflicted military defeats on Qing forces and forced China's leaders to accept a series of humiliating treaties. The provisions of these treaties undermined China's ability to rule her people, and the Europeans carved China into spheres of influence that set the stage for economic exploitation and handicapped the Qing dynasty's ability to deal with domestic problems. As the government tried to cope with foreigners, it also faced dangerous internal upheavals, the most important of which was the Taiping Rebellion. Caught between aggressive foreigners and Chinese rebels, the ruling elites developed reform programs to maintain social order and strengthen the state and preserve the Qing dynasty. These reforms had very limited effect, however, and by the 20th century, China was in a seriously weakened condition. So the Chinese Empire under siege. Since 1759, European commercial presence was limited to the one port called Guangzhou. The Guild of Chinese merchants that were authorized by the central government to trade with the Western merchants at Guangzhou, which is actually Canton, prior to the First Opium War, were the only ones that could work with the Europeans. These were called Kohongs. Now, these firms were also called foreign trade firms or Yang Heng, and the merchants, actual merchants who directed the were called Hong merchants, Hang Sheng. The most popular, of course, or the most insidious of the traders in this port were the British East India Company, which was very heavily involved in the opium trade. Now, opium was grown in India and sold in China for silver, and silver was used to buy other Chinese products. Let's talk a little bit about the opium trade. In 1840, Britain went to war with China over the questions of trade, diplomacy, national dignity, and most importantly, drug trafficking. While the British officials tried to play down the illicit nature of that trade, the opponents gave it a name that made the link quite clear: the Opium Wars. The war settlement forced Chinese ports open and gave Hong Kong to the British. It began what China called the Century of Humiliation, when foreign powers were forced weak Chinese governments to give up territory and to sign unequal treaties. And then the second war, the Second Opium War, was with France and Great Britain against China from 1856 to 1860. And it was also a defeat for the Chinese. So these unequal treaties that China was forced into, these were very disadvantageous for the Chinese. And as you well know, probably through history, Hong Kong, which was given to the British, didn't come back until into the 1990s. And this extraterritorial status that was given to the British and the French subjects, or any foreigner who managed to get into the ports and claim a sphere of influence, meant that they were not bound by Chinese laws. This really angered the Chinese people because these foreigners were only bound by their foreign laws in Chinese country, and that didn't sit well at all with the people. And of course, like I said later on, other European countries came in and demanded the same types of treaties. So there was a series of rebellions that took place, and the Taiping was one of them, the most important of them. But there was another one, the Neon Rebellion, and that was actually kind of overshadowed, of course, by that large-scale rebellion of the Taiping. But the Neon Rebellion showed one thing, that the people were discontented. They were discontented by the incompetence and the mismanagement of the Qing emperors. And the rebellion actually contributed to that further weakening of the imperial system, which would eventually collapse in 1911. So this Taiping Rebellion was begun by Chinese religious prophet, and he was a leader of the Taiping Rebellion, during which time he declared his own dynasty, which centered on that captured city of Nanjing. Now, this great upheaval, in which more than 20 million people are said to have been killed, drastically altered the course of modern Chinese history. Leading up to the large-scale rebellions, the population actually rose 50% between 1800 and 1900. But the problem was that cultivation of the land remained static. They weren't any more productive than they had been before, and they had more mouths to feed. So we get the Nian Rebellion, then we get the Muslim Rebellion, then we get the Tongan Rebellion, but the eclipse, of course, is the Taiping Rebellion led by Hong Qiquan. He was a school teacher, and he's the one who started his own dynasty, and he called for the destruction of the Qing dynasty. So, the Taiping program. The Taiping actually took their beliefs very seriously. They took their beliefs from many different sources, too. Some of those beliefs reflected the traditional Confucianism, and some were from ancient writings that described ideal systems that had never been practiced. Other ideas were Western in origin, and clearly this blend of ideas was very powerful because when they were introduced to the people, they had never heard anything like this before, and the Taipings promised their followers a totally new system, which is exactly what they were giving them. Their program was pretty wide-ranging here. It introduced notions of common property, abolition of private property, land reform, equal position of women, abstinence from opium, tobacco, and alcohol, calendar reform, literary reform, and above all, a new political military organization of society. So how were the Taiping defeated? Well, you remember they captured Nanjing in 1858, and they made it into their capital. Feeling like they were very forceful, they made an attack on Beijing. They went there with a force of 1 million, but it was pushed back. It was turned back. So this imperial army of the Qing dynasty was unable to control these Taiping. So what they did was create regional armies with the Manchu soldiers. But these Manchu soldiers were outfitted with European top-of-the-line weaponry. Hong, the schoolteacher, committed suicide in 1864. Nanjing was recaptured, and in that recapture, about 100,000 Taipings were actually massacred within the city. So one of the things that happened was the self-strengthening movement, okay? And the high point of that was 1860 to 1870. The self-strengthening movement succeeded in securing the revival of the dynasty from this brink, the Qing dynasty from the brink of eradication, sustaining it for about another half century. The considerable successes of the movement came to an abrupt end when with China's defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895. What was this self-strengthening movement? Well, it was a slogan: Chinese learning at the base, Western learning for use, meaning they can borrow from the Western culture, but the base of their culture was to be Chinese. It was a blend of cultural traditions and with European industrial technology, including shipyards and railroads and academics as those that were acquired. Changes in the Chinese economy and society. The Dowager, Shichi, diverted funds for her own purposes, though, and some people hated her. Some people thought that she was good for the economy, but history will show us that she was very ruthless, poisoning her own family, her own children to maintain her power. Now, the Qing dynasty, these spheres of influence, we're going to talk about that for a few minutes. The Qing dynasty loss of influence in Southeast Asia led to the Europeans and the Japanese coming in and just kind of carving up China. Okay, in 1900, China's glory days were behind her. China was a nation in decline. In 1900, China was heavily controlled by these foreign nations who tended to dominate the ports. China was still ruled by the Qing family, though the family didn't have much power. The 19th century sees a really marked involvement in China by the European powers. The Opium Wars, of course, were part of that. And it also was a series of humiliating defeats. She had to hand over to Britain the strategically important port of Hong Kong. And in 1894 and 95, Japan actually attacked China. This led to the defeat of China, and Japan took from China Korea, Formosa, Taiwan, which is Taiwan, and Port Arthur. One of the consequences of these wars was that China lost control of her seaports, of course. 50 of China's most prosperous ports were treaty ports, which meant they were open to foreign trade and residence. European nations also divided China into these spheres of influence, and in these spheres, the European nations that were in these spheres actually ran these areas. The wishes of the Chinese were completely ignored, and this created a great deal of resentment among the Chinese people. The 100 Days Reform. All right, so this was a movement that was very short-lived. The reforms aroused the opposition of the very conservative ruling elite, that's why. And they actually led a coup in 1898, and it was led by the Empress CH31, and she was the emperor that at the time was put under house arrest. 6 of the reformers were executed. Most of the reforms were actually taken back, and many of them were actually reinstated much later on in the following decade. But the failure of the reform movement had some real dramatic historical consequences. In its aftermath, the conservative gave free rein to that anti-foreign boxers. And these anti-foreign boxers were the ones who attacked the Christian missionaries and provoked another foreign invasion of North China. So the failure of the reform movement gave impetus to these revolutionary forces within China, and later contributed to the Chinese Revolution in 1911, about a decade later. This reform movement, was a pro-Western industrial movement. It interpreted Confucianism for their own purposes. It was definitely pro-industrialization, and many reforms were implemented. And of course, all those were nullified by the Empress Dowager. So let's take a look at the Boxer Rebellion. Now, the Empress Dowager threw her support behind the Society of what was called the Righteous and Harmonious Fist. These were the Boxers, the anti-foreign militia units. And in 1899, they fought to get rid of these foreigners. They wanted to get the foreign devils, out of China. They were misled to believe that these European weapons wouldn't harm them. So 140,000 Boxers actually attacked a European embassy in 1900, and of course they were completely crushed by the European superior technology of weapons. And China once again was forced to accept the stationing of foreign troops within their country. Eventually, the emperor dies. He dies a mysterious sudden death. Autopsy would later show that he actually died from a very high dose of arsenic. One day later, the Empress Dowager dies in November 1908. And then their 2-year-old Puyi was placed on the throne. There was a revolution in 1911, and of course Puyi left the throne, abdicated in 1912. And that ends the Chinese section of Chapter 31.